a little earlier time today. We appreciate you accommodating my schedule. We certainly welcome you here as we come down the home stretch. 3 days and counting till the legislature's over, and I'll just start by saying I think they're doing things in a very methodical and appropriate way, and particularly I'm pleased with the budget. The latest indications are that my number one priority, which is education funding, is also the legislature's number one priority, education funding. We've asked for significant amounts of money to be put into education. My original proposal was about $422 million. It appears that we're going to get that, maybe a little bit more, closer to $432 million. I think that's good. We have additional monies going for technology with flexibility to the local school districts. Approximately 70% of all the new money that we have in the budget is going to education. So again, I think we're prioritizing correctly. And as you know, my focus has been on economic development and growing the economy, which is really the foundation to have a good quality of life. And clearly labor and skilled labor, which is comes from a good educated society, is the focus here. And that means we have the ability to have long-term sustained economic growth. So we have reason to be very optimistic about the future of Utah when it comes to the economy because of the funding that we're putting into education. So I applaud the legislature. They're doing really good work there. I think they have an understanding of that important key component to have continued economic growth. And so I can't say enough about the legislature for their recognition of the need to fund appropriately education. With that, go ahead, questions.
You were quoted in the Washington Post, evidently after a meeting where Republicans discussed presidential politics. At Mitt Romney, the words Mitt Romney may have occurred at that meeting. Can you tell us, can you give us some insight as to about the meeting and as to what was said about presidential politics?
I assume, Rod, you're referring to, we had 5 other Republican governors in the state yesterday that I hosted. We have a Republican Governors Association gathering that we have every year, sometime in March, up at Deer Valley, and a lot of the sponsors of the Republican Governors Association, other interested parties come and gather. It's become one of the most popular events on the RGA schedule. In that discussion, clearly presidential politics came up, and the discussion about, handicapping what's going to happen with the Final Four here, March Madness, only in the political arena. And that discussion was there. Mitt Romney's name did come up. People commenting about his speech at the Hinckley Institute at the University of Utah. Mostly about, what's going to happen. Do we think Donald Trump's going to be the nominee? Do we have John Casey's coming up on the outside, one of our fellow governors? How's Marco Rubio doing? Ted Cruz, who's, I think, at the head of the poll here in Utah. So those discussions in a very general, random way were discussed.
Are they afraid of Donald Trump? Are your colleagues afraid of Donald Trump?
No, I wouldn't say they're afraid of Donald Trump at all. I think, like most Americans, they're a little bit puzzled about what's taking place and the fact that it seems like the rules of engagement, the rules that we've followed in the past, have been thrown out the window, and we have new rules in place. I think there was a concern about the public being engaged, and it's just a puzzlement about why statements being made which would have seemingly disqualified a candidate in previous election cycles is acceptable and okay this time. Although they say they think the tide seems to be turning a little bit, that there is some discontent with some of the statements that Donald Trump is making. That being said, the belief is, particularly for Republican governors, is maintain the Congress so we control the House and the Senate are really the key issues here. The belief that Donald Trump or any of the Republican side of the ledger, it's important that they have good people around them, that they appoint smart people so that the presidential policies that are developed are not just done in a vacuum by only one individual. and the Supreme Court appointments, which are significantly important. So all of those things were part and parcel of the discussion.
But Governor, a lot of establishment Republicans around the country, including Mitt Romney, are now looking for ways to make sure that Donald Trump doesn't win the nomination. Was that specifically discussed by Republican governors? And is that something as Republican governors you want to try to do? Do you want to try to stop Trump?
You know, there was not any discussion with me about stop Donald Trump. What can we do to stop Donald Trump? The discussion was more about, you know, what about this peculiar phenomenon that we observe, and can we understand it? What about how come the governors of Congress have fallen by the wayside when historically governors have been at the forefront? Most of the presidents that have been elected over the last, 50, 60 years have been, in fact, governors. And so there was the question, why did our governors' friends falter? John Kasich is still staying in there, and he has great admiration from the governors. 18 years in the Congress, author of the Balanced Budget Amendment, helped with welfare reform. Again, by the way, that had bubbled up from the states, which we appreciate, and it was adopted by the Congress and eventually signed into law by President Bill Clinton. And wondered if John Kasich, who seemed to have been kind of the gentleman in the room in all of these debates, the one that had the proper presidential decorum, why he is not succeeding as well as we would have thought. But it does appear, that he's kind of making a comeback and is starting to accelerate, maybe at the right time, coming down the home stretch. We'll have to wait and see. We also talked about, on March 21st, we'll have the presidential debate here in Utah. We hope there's a presidential debate here in Utah. And I think that's good for Utah, and I think, again, it will give us a little more clarity over these today, and then see what happens in the elections today, and we'll wait and see what we can do to impact the elections on March 21st and March 22nd.
Do you have reason to believe there won't be a Republican debate after it was announced?
Well, no, I have no reason to debate. I have no reason to believe that there won't be one, but I do note that Donald Trump has said if I've got it wrapped up, I may not come to Salt Lake. Now, I would think that would be a mistake on his part. I think there is still need for discussion and debate. All states, as much as can be done, ought to be a part of this discussion. I've been critical of the current system. I am critical of the current system because I don't think it's delivering us the best opportunity to vet the candidates. And after 4 or 5 elections, it's already almost decided, and only 4 or 5 states have weighed in. I think a better system is rotating regional primaries, and where every state has an opportunity to participate, shortening the election cycle from April, May, June, July, so you have 1 month for each section of the country. And it'll be a lot less expensive, and you may be strong in the east but not so strong in the west. But every state would now have an opportunity to weigh in. I think we'd get a much better caliber of candidate, and more people could afford to run for the presidency. No, I think, as I've mentioned before, I think all the candidates have strengths and all of them have weaknesses. We'll wait and see what happens, and I may endorse before the presidential debate here in Utah.
Last night, Governor, the Senate cleared the bill that would be able to invest in the Port of Oakland. The California reaction to that has been to call upon the Transportation Commission of the state there to defund that project at the state level because of health impacts. If that were to occur, and they were really going to throw a curve in on this coal discussion going through the Port of Oakland, would you endorse a stipulation saying that other commodities could go through there and we would be omitting coal? What would your position be?
Well, as I've mentioned before, coal is a legal product, and there probably is a role for the federal government to play here under the Commerce Clause. They're the ones that are supposed to regulate commerce so that we don't have differences between the states. I think it is a little unfortunate and unseemly that we would have a state, for whatever their reasons are, to say you cannot ship your legal product through our state. Again, I've mentioned that, if they greeted us on I-15 going into California and with a barrier and said you can't bring your product into the state of California, we'd have some concerns about that. I don't see a lot of difference between that and shipping out of one of the ports located in California. And it's not just Utah, it's Wyoming and other states that say we have a legal right to ship our product. If for some reason, for whatever it is, that we say this is not a legal product, then I understand it. Short of that, we ought to do everything we can to provide opportunities for our providers to ship whatever the product is, including coal. Now, too, we ought to just make mention, this is money to access some rights of ownership in this port. Is not coming from the taxpayer, it's coming from our mineral lease money. And it's coming from those counties that rely heavily on natural resource exportation and particularly coal. Carbon County, for example, nearly 11% of all their jobs in Carbon County are related to coal. And the ripple effect of that means that about 40%, nearly 41% of all the jobs in Carbon County are related to coal. You can understand why those, whether it be Carbon or Emery County or others, they're very concerned about some other state outside of our borders, and we don't care about your economy. We've got this notion that we don't want to have your product come through our state, causing a little bit of anxiety.
Senator Hancock there, who represents 1 million constituents, including Oakland, is indicating this is a health and safety issue, though, not a commerce issue. For them and for her specifically, an attendee at the Paris conference talks, climate talks, she's saying this is not good for the health and safety of my constituents.
Yeah, I don't know why it makes any difference whether it's shipped there or shipped elsewhere if it's a legal product. I understand those who are concerned about climate change and global warming. We all ought to gather together and say we want to have clean air and clean water. But to ban a product that's becoming, the extraction process is much cleaner. You go down and look at some of our coal-producing power plants, coal-fired power plants, and you'll see a very pristine area. The air quality there is better than it is here on the Wasatch Front, which is mostly coming from tailpipes. So I guess we ought to be banning in California, which has a lot worse air quality than we have here, ought to ban automobile sales. And again, it just doesn't make sense because of whatever their notions are. If they want to have the federal government change the law and make coal illegal, then maybe they've got something that's at least intellectually consistent.
Therefore, the Tenth Circuit Court today has decided to heard arguments in the Planned Parenthood appeal of your decision to block their funding.
Mhm.
How do you think your odds are going to be before the Tenth Circuit?
Well, it's hard for me to handicap the courts and know what they're going to say. I believe that we are in solid footing when it comes to the state's ability to contract. The issue is sometimes talked in terms of Planned Parenthood only, and forgetting the fact that the state of Utah has the ability to contract, and under the terms of that contract, they can change them, modify them. I know that when we worked with Planned Parenthood, we followed the contract to the T, gave them notice, as we were required to under the contract, 30 days notice, and then decided we would not renew them. So that aspect is what really is going to be, I think, at front and center today, is does the state have the ability to contract? And so we'll have to wait and see what happens. I'm sure, making great arguments. The Attorney General has a responsibility to do that. And as I understand, that's being done now, and we'll see what happens.
There are two abortion-related bills in the session right now, one from Senator Bramble and one from Representative Odo, although that one may or may not get heard now. If the debate around those bills becomes contentious, do you worry that that could influence the court's decision?
Well, I would hope the courts would be wise enough to know that it has no bearing on the issue at hand. And I would hope that courts aren't swayed by just emotion. Their job as a judge is to make sure that they apply the law and the facts to the law and make a decision whether they like the outcome or not. It has to be based on the rule of law and applying the facts to the law. And emotion should have nothing to do with it.
If the abortion bill's passed, are you going to sign it?
I haven't seen the law, so I'm a little at loss to know whether I like the law or not. I'll have to take a look at that. I'm a very much pro-life person, but again, I want to make sure that whatever we do is balanced against the law. I don't want to be just emotional about it either. And I know the idea of making sure that we don't, that the fetus feels no pain when it's aborted. You know, I understand that. We ought to err on the side of life and on the side of pain-free. So the other one, I think, Representative Oda has got some significant, I think, constitutional notes that need to be looked at and reviewed. So I'll wait and see what happens as it goes through the process to decide that when it comes to my desk.
The Judge Newford has asked the state to brief him on what happens if he has to strike down the thresholds in the signature gathering.
Say that again, I missed the first one.
The signature gathering portions of SB 54.
Yes.
Newford's indicated it seems likely to strike those down. Do you think the legislature should step in and try to revise those thresholds, or do you think we let the judge rule at this point and proceed in the way?
Well, what we've agreed to do, I think, on all sides of the issue, and is to let the courts make the decision. And, you know, I understand the arguments. The compromise, so-called, was designed to protect the caucus convention system, which I also support. And the intent was to, I guess, supersede what appeared to be a process where the public, and at least the polling would indicate, going to just a general primary. For those of us who've been involved in the caucus convention system, we think that probably plays into the hands of the wealthy and the famous. Whereas if you have to deal with 4,000 delegates, you can be vetted, and it's a lot less expensive, and an unknown like myself, you know, has an opportunity to compete against the more wealthy and the more well-known. And so I understand the intent. I think that the compromise was designed to keep that in place. What I think was unfortunate was the intent in the legislation to put in unaffiliated voters in the mix, which was not asked by the Count My Vote people. And it appears that the threshold, because when that's been thrown out by Judge Newford, then now the threshold seems to be a little bit high, at least beyond what I understand to be constitutional limits. So I understand the conflict, and I think the judge is going to have to give us clarity and certainty. I know they're talking about it upstairs, about should we, the legislature, step in and kind of resolve it. There's a couple of proposals, just a simple fix to lower the threshold percentage-wise. We'll have to wait and see what the legislature decides to do, but as for me, again, I'm happy to have the courts make that decision and bring the clarity that we need to have as a state.
What about the provision in the National Defense Authorization Act that you and a lot of other governors seem to find very troubling?
Say that again?
The National Defense Authorization Act. There was a report that you and I think it was 42 other governors signed a letter saying that there's a provision in that that actually puts states basically in danger and gives governors less access to technicians that they need to have.
Well, maybe I need to go back and review that and see exactly what the issue was, but my concern, I think, with the National Defense Act was the loss of control the governors would have with our National Guard, and that they would be put under command of somebody outside of our governors. And also the funding aspects of them taking some of our Apache helicopters and some of our resources that we have here, and disproportionately taking away from the states, and with this reauthorization have those resources be given to the regular Army and regular Air Force, and put us in a position that we are not combat ready at the National Guard level.
As you wind down a couple of your sessions ago, or there have been some sessions in which you expressed concerns about some of the bills that are moving through. I think one time you actually said you would veto a gun bill if it actually got through. Any bills that are on that concern list right now that you can enumerate?
You know, Bob, as you know, and everybody should know, our methodology here in my administration has been to work as closely as we can with the legislators. They've been very good to come and talk to us about what is my position on these pieces of legislation. If I've got concerns, to make adjustments and modifications so that we can have a piece of legislation that I can sign in good conscience and not have to veto. And that's worked very well. We don't veto as many bills here as some states, and that's partly because we work a little more closely with our legislators, which I think gives us better legislation. And so I don't know that I see anything on the horizon, but we go through an extensive review process. If this year is like last year's, we will have probably passed in this legislature somewhere around 500 bills, in which we will take the next 3 weeks from the session's over to review each and every bill, to understand what the intent is, the bill is, and if there's any unintended consequences of the bill. If that happens, then we might want to veto the bill. If we have unintended consequences which we don't like, sometimes they just make mistakes. We've had to veto bills to have them come back and correct it. So we will take our responsibility very seriously on signing bills and vetoing bills, and that's the next 3 weeks of my life after Thursday.
One of the bills that passed last night was a resolution urging the state to pursue its claim against the federal government over the public lands. And it's a concurrent resolution, which means you would have to join in it, and it would state the policy of the state to pursue this litigation. I've asked you about this several times during this course of the session, but now it looks like it's gonna be coming to your desk more likely. Do you have any additional thoughts on where you are on this? I mean, you're gonna have to make a decision on this.
We've worked closely with the sponsor of the bill, Representative Stratton. We've made some suggested changes which we think will happen, which we think gives a little more clarity and reflects more accurately our enabling clause when we became a state. And again, what we want to do is to have the ability to manage the public lands, have more input as a state. There is no intent to privatize the public land. That's one of the big lies out there. But there is an attempt to see if we cannot, in fact, manage to this optimal level our public lands, which includes not only just natural resource development, but our agricultural interests out there, protecting our water rights, and make sure our farmers and ranchers have the ability to utilize the property. That's part of the frustration you see is they feel like they're being squozed off the public land, and under the Taylor Grazing Act, losing more animal units out there. Again, we support the public land initiative that's being sponsored by Congressman Bishop and Congressman Chaffetz and Senator Lee. It's disappointing to see things that are being put on the television and ads and the media, which is a total distortion of what Congressman Bishop was trying to do. There is no intent to sell off land around arches. That's a big lie. In fact, there's another 20,000 acres that Congressman Bishop would like to put around as a buffer around arches. The president cannot do that, but Congress can. It's giving more access to our stream beds. 301 miles of streams to have access and preserve and protect those stream beds, which is certainly an important thing. 1.2 million acres to protect the Bears Ears. The Bears Ears, which seems to be now a new modern phenomena from our Native American friends, they'd like to have that area kind of preserved and protected. It's not been talked about in the last 3 years. It's kind of a new thing, but at least there's a sensitivity by the Congress to say, well, let's protect that. They wanted 1.8 million. The local people down there, including Commissioner Benally, who is a full-blooded Navajo, represents the Navajo Nation, out there has said 800,000. Congressman Bishop's putting out 1.2. A good compromise to kind of protect and preserve that area what the Native Americans are saying we think is important. It makes all kind of sense that we ought to allow that process to happen. Last, it makes no sense to have somebody, for mainly political purposes, it appears, to come in and just with a wave of a wand designate a new national monument and jeopardize conservation efforts that are significantly more broad than that. For the sake of getting 1.8 million acres and to throw out 16 other million acres that could be developed appropriately, rationally, responsibly, being good stewards of the earth, it would be, I think, a step backwards in our state when it comes to protecting and preserving and finding the optimal benefit of the public lands.
So
But
you
they
would
decide
you
what-
would sign the resolution then saying it's the state policy?
Well, again, there's some suggestions I've made to modify it. There's some things in there I didn't like, the phraseology and some of the things that have been said. I think there's going to be some modification and changes on a couple of those bills that Representative Stratton's involved with. But again, the concept of what they're proposing, I support.
The legislature seems to, they seem seem likely to appropriate even more money than you asked for homelessness. Would you comment?
Well, we've done a very good job in the state of Utah in reducing and almost eliminating chronic homelessness. Now, I want to make sure we understand there's a difference between chronic homelessness, people that are always homeless, as opposed to those who have situations that occur. We still have homeless people, whether they're part of the chronic homeless population or not. And so, again, I appreciate the fact that we are working very diligently on eliminating homelessness entirely. We always will have probably people who are impoverished. We're doing a very good job in Utah of making sure that we give what people who are impoverished want to have, and that's a job. What's the best thing I can give? Not a government handout program, but a job where they can support themselves. And not only are we eliminating chronic homelessness, but we're having a significant dent when it comes to homelessness overall. And the good news for all of us here in Utah is we're working together, hand in hand, and we've reduced the poverty rate in Utah from 15% to 10%. We're 1/3 below the national average. For our children's poverty rates, we're 50% below the national average. So we're doing some really good things, and I appreciate and applaud the legislature, again, prioritizing correctly. It's a finite amount of money, and prioritizing is a tough thing to do. But I think this legislature is doing an excellent job of prioritizing the taxpayers' dollars.
Time on Thursday, meet you.
All right. Thank you. 3 days and counting.